Okay, let's go ahead and while we're waiting, I guess, for a few people to arrive, let's go ahead and set up our folder for today. So we've got today's the 22nd. Okay, so just to give you kind of a preview of how the rest of the semester is going to go, we should have 3 more assignments, 6, 7, and 8. And those, so I'm not going to assign number 6 this week because we don't quite know enough yet to do that assignment, but I'll do that next week. I will note that the assignments, I mean, I guess it's always opinion, but in my opinion, they get a little bit easier. Because one of them is just basic WordPress, and I think a lot of people in here used WordPress before. If you haven't, it's like no coding at all. So you get to, it's almost like these Flexbox and Grid Gardens assignments. How many people, just a quick survey so I know whether to use it next semester, how many people found those helpful, 4 and 5, for learning it? Somewhat? You're pretty well. What's that? Very helpful? Okay.
Yeah, I know.
Okay. So I'll keep on using those.
But in the broad aspect of it, you just kind of got understood the whole
Yeah.
understanding.
Yeah, it's for layouts, and it's kind of cool. In practice, you sometimes don't use those layouts that complicated, but it's like, I guess anything else, it's like if you're training for a sport, you might, you got to work on fundamentals, even though you might not use it in every game.
So will assignment 6, you'll assign next week and we do the following week?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't want to get into it too much just yet. It won't make sense without context, but it's my hope that it's easier. Is everyone good on the exam? Like as far as like you get your grade, you know what you got, you kind of have some sense. I don't want to go through the whole thing because we're kind of limited on time, but the basic idea was that you just had to go in and adjust some pixel values, you know, that sort of stuff. Most people did pretty okay. Lots of A's and B's. A couple people were clever. Rather than doing pixel values, you switched over to percentages. Was that you?
A little bit.
Okay.
A little bit.
So,
Yeah,
you did it too?
Yeah.
Okay.
I just found it a little easier.
Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit.
In practice, it's probably better. I just wanted everyone to get used to it, but I'm like, if they worked around the system, then that's, I can't take off points for that. No, that's fine.
When I was working around the pixels, I was like, oh my god.
Yeah.
What were the correct dimensions on the pixel size?
So the basic idea was that it had to add up to less than the container.
Right.
I don't remember the exact breakpoints I used. I think one of them was like 960 pixels, I think.
600.
Yeah, one
Yeah.
was 960 and then the other I think was 660.
So like for example on the 960 container, like maybe like a 200, 200, 200, 200.
And then space.
And then yeah, you end up with 160 extra pixels to work with, something like that. That was the basic idea. I wouldn't get too caught up in it because we're gonna switch focus on the course now.
And then when you condense it down 2 cards, it was 660, so you should be how many pixels?
I didn't have an exact number in mind. It just needed to be less than 660.
Okay. Alright.
Okay. So let's talk about. So we're going to enter a new phase in the course. So the last part of the course is basically going to be something called Bootstrap.
Oh my god.
Have you worked with it before? Oh, okay.
No, but it sounds crazy.
No, it's actually not. The whole purpose was, I'll give you the quick history, but let's open up some links first. It's this thing. So it's going to generate a lot more code than using like Flexbox and Grid manually, but a lot of it's copy, paste, modify, if that makes sense. So you'll take a big chunk of code, you might not necessarily understand what all of it means, and then you'll just modify the little bits that you need to modify generally. Okay, so let's go to the W3 Schools Bootstrap 4 tutorial. I think this is actually an older version, 4.1. I think 4.3 or something like that, but it's basically the same. Okay. So I'll give you a quick history while you're getting set up. Get brackets open and all that stuff. So a few years ago, gosh, probably 7, 8 years ago, something like that now, Twitter, the social media company, what they realized is that on their platform, they had very little consistency as in their CSS. So what I mean is, like, if you'd go across the sites, people would use like a blue color, but it would be like off by a little bit, and they had different standardization issues of people using slightly different margins, slightly different padding, slightly different breakpoints. So you know how in the first half of the class we were kind of manually specifying a lot of values? That's what they found, is that once you get to something, you know, within Twitter as large as Twitter, because obviously the main Twitter website at the time, that's like apps and stuff, but back then it was, I think they were a little bit more focused on the website. They have other things besides that, you know, internally, and other tools and advertising tools and all that sort of stuff. And what they wanted is that across their platform, they wanted consistency. They wanted it to always look like Twitter. They didn't want it to look like kind of like a counterfeit version of Twitter, you know, like where everything's like a little bit off. It's not quite the same. So what they did is they created this framework called Bootstrap. Front-end framework. Yeah, 8 years ago. There's probably some history. It's basically that. Whatever. History doesn't matter a whole lot, but the basic idea was that they wanted it to make it like foolproof. That way you could have a site that was responsive, because think 8 years ago, that's when mobile, like smartphones, because I think the iPhone was released basically about 10 years ago. So they were looking for websites that could work, you know, from mobile all the way up to the largest of TVs, and they wanted it to be seamless. They didn't want to have people adding all these breakpoints like we've had to do previously. At the time, Flexbox and Grid didn't exist, and so doing layouts was a pain. Like, remember that first assignment where we had to do margin auto and all these other things, and even our navigation, we kind of cheated and we used Flexbox. When they first wrote this, none of that stuff was around, so they had to use floats for everything, and it was miserable. It was like, if you wanted to create a navigation, it was like you had to float everything, and it was just a giant headache. Or revert to tables, which is kind of looked down upon. So they wanted a framework where, like, the most common things that you could do, like setting up stuff in a grid, and then when we get to a mobile device, shrink it down to one column. They wanted that to be as easy as possible. And then things like margins and padding and stuff like that, and color theming, they wanted it to be higher level. They didn't want people to have to work with basic low-level CSS anymore. They wanted to give you higher level tools that were kind of like pick a piece, pick a piece, pick a piece here, and then make a website. Now there are a few conceptual things. Oh, and then just real quick on the history, the most recent version is Bootstrap 4. It's interesting because with the most recent version, since there's been some developments, it's actually Flexbox based. So the stuff you learned with Flexbox, if you need to do something a little bit custom, I don't think we're probably going to do that in this class, because but if you need to, it's available. So you can remember all the different flexy things that we would do, like with if I wanted to do space around or space between, or if I wanted to, all that's possible in Bootstrap through the use of Flexbox. So yeah, right here, CSS flexible box support. Oh, that's nice. Yeah, so one of the downsides is it uses a framework or just a JavaScript library called jQuery. Has anybody had to work with jQuery before? So jQuery is real quick, we won't use it in this class, but just so you know what it is. It's a JavaScript library. So remember you used to, when you took your last class, the scripting class with JavaScript, and some things were like very low level, like did you have to do a lot of get element by ID,
Yes.
that sort of stuff?
I hated doing that.
Yeah. So jQuery, what they did is kind of the same thing. They said, okay, these very, very low level tasks, let's make them a little bit simpler. They made a bunch of weird design decisions where jQuery, it's like once you get to know it, it's really simple and fast to use, but it's like this, it's kind of a steep learning curve, and it uses a lot of weird callbacks and older JavaScript coding mechanisms that aren't that popular anymore. So it looks like in the next version of Bootstrap, they're actually dropping it. These days, actually, a lot of people use the newer versions of JavaScript. It's called ES6 and later. It's like they versioned it now. They don't just call it JavaScript. It'll be like ES6, ES7, ES8, and so on. And then there's another JavaScript variant called TypeScript. So if you ever get out in the industry and you have to do some scripting, the chances are you're probably not going to be doing very, very low level stuff. You'll probably end up using something like TypeScript or a newer version of JavaScript like ES6. Okay, with all that aside, so that was just buying time to get everybody set up. W3 Schools has a halfway decent Bootstrap tutorial. The main Bootstrap site is pretty decent, but it tends not to be very tutorial based. It's like more like examples, and then they don't really necessarily explain the examples a whole lot. It's a lot of copy and paste. It's like this thing here called the Jumbotron. And it's like, okay, well, what do I do with this? Well, what you do is you view the source, and then you go through and copy and paste. There's not a whole lot of explanation. There's lots of examples. W3 Schools does a little bit more of a conceptual explanation. So the basic idea is that, so Bootstrap handles at least two things very well. It probably handles other things as well. One is it gives you prepackaged components that behave well for all scenarios. What I mean by that is they're responsive, they align correctly, they handle all the different browser versions, they do all that for you. And rather than creating our own cards like we were doing before, there's an actual card component. If I can find it. Yeah, there we go. So if we want to have a card, like one of these things right here, we just copy and paste the code. It's very straightforward, and all the code usually does is it's kind of class based, and each one of these, it's like how much do you want to include? Do you want to include just the body? Do you want the body and a header? Do you want an image as well? And so on. So that's one part of it. It's all these components. What's great about these components is that, again, they're by default responsive, they behave well, all that sort of stuff. Then there's grid, and I don't know the timeline exactly, but I'm pretty sure the original Bootstrap came out before CSS Grid, and I think it was very influential on like the HTML standards organizations realizing that HTML needed some sort of grid system. CSS3's grid, what we used like a few weeks ago, it's extremely powerful, but it's also extremely low level in that, remember, we had to do things like set our own breakpoints and all that stuff. It's relatively low level. The grid system within Bootstrap, it's considerably simpler, but it's a little bit more constrained. So they say, okay, well, here's the grid system. I don't think you can span rows. I've never done it anyway within Bootstrap. If I'm going to get that sophisticated, I usually just fall back to CSS Grid. But within these rules, it's like the most common use cases. It's based on 12 columns, and then the idea is that works well because you can have, okay, if you want something to be 50-50, you have 6 and 6. If you want something to be a third and a third and a third, you have 4, 4, 4. So this is spanning 4 columns, spanning 4 columns. And the nice thing is that it adds up. A lot of the tough thing with percentage-based stuff is that a lot of times if you want something that's 1/3, it's like your pixel values don't quite add up because it's like, okay, 33%, 33%, 33%. Well, what happened to that last 1%? Even though visually you wouldn't notice the difference. This is just a little bit more convenient having it based on 12. If you want quarters, you have 3, 3, 3, 3. It's very powerful. So we have this grid system. And we also have something called container. See if we can find it. Yeah, okay. And the idea of a container is, remember before we had to set up all of our own breakpoints with media queries? Container handles all that for you. So there's just a class called container, and that's you probably noticed me using the word container a lot, and that's kind of influenced from this, is because we were setting our own breakpoints and doing all that. But it handles all that for you. Okay, so we don't have to worry about that anymore. It does automatic breakpoints. It's very convenient. And once we put these components inside of these containers, it's great because these components act correctly. Like, it's just very intuitive. Remember how we had an image and we had to do all kinds of stuff with max width and percentages and all that stuff? This handles it automatically. So if we have an image that's too large for its container, it automatically resizes it for us. It's very convenient. Okay. So enough about that. Let's go ahead and start off with just a very, very basic example. Let's just get to, so let's start off, let me find a good try it yourself. I don't know if there's a great one here. Yeah, okay. So under links, find W3 Schools Bootstrap. It should take you here, just right to the home page. And just to keep life simple, the first example, let's click try it yourself. To be perfectly honest, I don't really care about this example, but you will probably notice that there's a lot of stuff that we're importing. That's the whole reason I want this. I don't really care about this specific example. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all, copy, and then let's paste it into an ex, we'll call this ex1.html. And what I'm going to do is I actually want to code this first example from scratch. So get it to the point where you've got all this stuff up here, but the body is empty. Now, unfortunately, HTML shell doesn't, they have a lot of cool things, but they don't have like a Bootstrap button where it'll generate a shell for Bootstrap. So that's why I find myself doing this. Don't worry about what all this stuff up here is. These are just basically, yeah.
I'm sorry, what did you copy and paste? What did you do that?
So that was under,
Yeah, W3 Schools Bootstrap.
yeah, so links, W3 Schools Bootstrap.
And I think it's the first example under the
Yeah, home, and then this example right here. And then when you open it, it'll open this, and then just highlight the whole thing, and then paste it into brackets. And then we're going to clear out the body because I want to code this from scratch. So there's a class that we're going to use all the time, but let's do this. Let's kind of work backwards. So let's create a paragraph of lorem ipsum text. Try to grab a fairly large paragraph that we have something to work with here. And so, okay, we're not even going to use Bootstrap just yet. Let's just, I mean, we've got it up here. We've got the scripts that we're including. But let's just start off with a plain old paragraph. So even though we put in a plain old paragraph, what do you already notice? Maybe with the fonts and the line spacing. This is not what a normal paragraph looks like, I don't think, right? It actually gives you some default styling by default. Rather than going all the way back to browsers of the early 90s, it says, okay, what are some default styling that people would use on a modern website? So even before we did anything, it gave us some basic styling. So let's do this. Let's wrap this in a class. So we'll have div. So all I did was surround that one paragraph with a div. And then I'm going to set it to a class called container. And you should be used to this class name and kind of its purpose because we've worked with this before. But this is a container, not a container that we define, but this is actually a container that is given to us by Bootstrap. So we wrapped our paragraph in a div with the class container. And you'll notice it's like, okay, there's something going on here. And what happened is it actually, now that we wrapped it in this special class called container, remember when we were manually setting those breakpoints? It sets all that for us now. We don't have to worry about breakpoints anymore, just by adding that one class. And what'll happen is, notice that we've got our, so I'm going to do this kind of slow. We have various breakpoints. And these were essentially breakpoints that we were setting manually before, but now just by wrapping it in that one container class, we have that automatically available. Now there is one variant of container. Notice that those breakpoints are very hard. It's like you hit a breakpoint and then it shrinks in. You hit a breakpoint and it shrinks in. I tend to prefer that, and I think a lot of sites use that. But there is one variant. We're not going to use it very often in this class. It's called container fluid. And rather than having those hard breakpoints, it's like a constant. Does that make sense? Now it may seem weird, like why even have it then? Because that's the behavior we got earlier. There are times that it still kind of triggers the breakpoint event. So for other components will act differently at different sizes, but this acts much more fluidly. But let's just we'll keep the default version for now. Okay, so that's the basic premise, the basic setup, is that we're going to be using this container surrounding everything, and it causes things to kind of have a nice behavior. So now let's talk about the grid system. So if we go back to W3 Schools, if you scroll down, grid is actually important enough that they actually give it its own section. There's like a one paragraph little thing on grid up here, but this is considerably more comprehensive. And so the basic idea is that we usually do this with divs, but pretty much any block level element, but most of the time I'm working with a div when I do this, is that each column, you can almost think of it like a cell, but they like to use the term column. If we wanted to act differently at different breakpoints, all we have to do is use different class names. We don't have to go back. Remember how we were doing before? We'd actually go in the media queries and we'd add all things that are the same. So it's still going to be obviously a grid-based system. This one's a little bit more row-based. Remember the other CSS grid? It was like we could do like where we could have it span multiple columns and all this and this other stuff. This is going to be a little bit more row-based. The same does apply. Remember before that if we went over on our columns, what happened? Let's say, for example, I had we'll say 12 columns, and I hit the 13th column. What happens? Remember it wrapped around to the next row? Does everyone remember that? That still applies here as well, okay? So rather than getting too caught up in these rules, let's go ahead and do this. Let's copy and paste example 1 to save us a little bit of time. By the way, we're going to be doing a lot of this in future examples because obviously it's a pain to regenerate this whole thing, you know, all this scripting stuff up here. So we'll be doing a lot of copying and pasting. And this is going to be our example 2. Now to set up the grid system, all we have to do is add a div that contains the class row. So let's go ahead and do that. So within container, I'm going to do div, class is equal to row, and then make sure that it matches on the other side here so that when you save it, we've got a paragraph on the inside, we've got a row, and then we've got our container. So right now, a grid system doesn't make a whole lot of sense because we only have the one paragraph. I guess to make life a little bit easier, I'm just going to shorten this paragraph just a little bit so we can see it a little bit better. And let's do 3 paragraphs. So we don't even need to go all the way back to lorem ipsum. I'm just going to copy and paste these 3. And here's going to be the basic setup is that we've got a container, a row, 3 plain old paragraphs that we haven't added any classes or styling to yet, and then we're gonna do some stuff here in a minute. But just make sure that you're at that point. So how would we make this a 3-column design? We do that by kind of some special class naming that they've come up with. So let's walk through it on the first paragraph and then we'll do it for all 3. So we say class is equal, and let's say, so I want a 3-column design. What we're going to do is, let's do this. We'll say call LG 4. It seems like a pretty weird class name, but I'll explain it in a second. So call-LG-4. What this does is it says, it's kind of like a naming convention that they came up with. So they're saying, okay, we're dealing with a column-based class. When the device pixels are large and up, so right here we can say, okay, 992 pixels up, so to infinity, but in practice like maybe like 4,000 pixels or so. So 992 pixels up. I want this paragraph to take up 4 columns. If you remember, we're on a 12 12 column system. So what's this percentage wise, roughly, or fraction wise, what's this going to take up? A third. So if we want a 3 column design, that works out because we've got 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Let's apply this class to the other paragraphs. And just like that, without having to do any sort of pixel math, we've been able to create a 3 column design just by using CSS classes. Hopefully you can see this is the reason this library is so popular, this framework, is because you can do very simple things like this and get like a modern looking responsive website. And let's just test this. So the pixel values, it said 992. So we should see something should happen at 992 pixels. So it did give us our 3 column design. And then at that 992 pixels, so we see our first breakpoint, second breakpoint. So this is extra large. Remember it said from 992 up? Well, this is what it looks like for XL, LG for large, but then anything below that, it just defaults back to a single column design. So what if we wanted to get a little bit more sophisticated? We wanted to say, okay, well at large, I want it to act a certain way, but then medium, maybe I want to go down to a 2 column design. So let's do that. Let's say from medium on up, which is going to turn out just to be, so it goes extra small, small, medium, large, extra large. So this one, it was large on up, so large to extra large. Here, since we're going to do medium, MD for medium, that's just basically saying, okay, medium on up, but in practice, since we've specified something for large, it's just like just that little range of medium. And if we want it to be a 2 column design, what would I put here?
2.
So
6.
yeah.
Oh, 6. Okay.
You are right in that it's tough with the terminology sometimes. It's like how many, do you want it to, are you talking about 2 columns of the 12? Or are you talking about 2 columns like overall page? In that context, I meant kind of like over the overall page, but you are right. It's, if we were to say we have a 12 column layout and we want it to span 6, essentially. We want it to span half of it. And then, so let's do that for all 3 of these. Now, what problem do you already see? Not really a problem, but just something to be aware of. Does this add up to 12? 6 plus 6 plus 6? No. So what do you think is going to happen to that last paragraph? Just like with grid, yep, it's going to wrap around to the next row. Notice that we still only define 1 row. Row is more conceptual than anything. It doesn't actually mean 1 physical row. And so let's start off. So at our very large devices, 3 column or 1/3 layout, same thing here. But now, yeah, so it's still kind of like a 2 column setup here, but then it wrapped around. But when we hit small devices, it still does go back to that single column. Now this may be a little bit excessive in OCD, but one of the things I do like to do is still specify, just to be super clear, that extra small and larger, that's going to take up the full width. This is probably excessive. It's just something I've been doing for over 5 years since I've been using Bootstrap. So you don't have to do it, but it's just kind of me just being very clear exactly what's happening. A lot simpler than having to deal with Flexbox and Grid, correct? You just add some class names just to do a little bit of math, not much, and then all of a sudden you get a responsive site. So by default, that doesn't, or just by itself, that doesn't seem very interesting. So let's do this. I told you that there are some components. Let's explore the card component. Now, as you can see here, there are way too many cards for us to go through. What I'll do is I'll just introduce a few components, and then you'll get the hang of it. Really, conceptually, the only thing that you really have to understand is like the grid system and the container breakpoints, the idea of a component, and then there's some styling stuff with like if I make a button and it's an important button, we have like this concept of primary and secondary colors, but we'll get to that another time. But what we want to do is reproduce this card right here. Okay. And so you can see here they've got some div classes equal to card, and then we've got card body. If we want to get even more sophisticated, the card can have a header and a footer. If you notice the naming convention we've been using in this class, I've been doing things like this, and that's why, because there's an actual name for this. I can't remember what it is, but it's like you've got your main thing. In this case, it's a card. And then you're saying, okay, this is going to be the card's header, this is going to be its body, its footer, and it just kind of keeps you organized. That's a very common thing. There's some backlash to this in the past. I don't know if I'd say backlash, but maybe different thinking on this, that people started to use these things called utility classes. I don't want to get into that today, but don't take this as the only way you can do things, okay? But here's the one I want to look at. This one seems the most interesting right here. Okay, so this one correlates to this. So we've got our card, which wraps everything. It's got an image, so perfect. You can see that Bootstrap has supplied us with all these cool classes. This is called card image top. What do you think if we wanted it at the bottom? Probably card image bottom, right? So these are named pretty intuitively. This is going to be the body of our card. We've got a title, and then the text, and then we've actually even got a button. I'll explain what these mean next week. I don't want to get into them. Let's go back to example 1. Let's copy and paste. And let's just get rid of the paragraph. We'll leave container. Actually, we're doing pretty good on time. I actually might be able to explain buttons as well. And just take this whole div right here, copy and paste it inside of container. Like I said, lots of copying and pasting of these components. Because even if you don't understand what all these class names do, I think most people could go in here and modify the name, the text, the button, and so on. So it's much more verbose, but it's just like a lot of copy, paste, modify. So let's go ahead and view this, but as you can see here, what are we missing? The image. So let's go ahead and download that. Let's go back to W3 Schools. You should just be able to right-click either image, really. It doesn't really matter. But I'm just going to do this image. That way we don't have to rename it. And then put it in your folder for today. So inside of your 1022 folder, you should have this image. It's called img_avatar1.png. And then now when we go to, I have to Do a full refresh. Yeah. Now we can see our card. So I hope I'm not moving too fast. All we did was basically we copied and pasted example 1. We have our container, and then we pasted in that card, and then we added the image. And just, well, you get the idea. If you needed to modify it, I think most people in here could modify it. Like if I wanted to modify the name, that's under card title, the actual main text right here. You could put a full lorem ipsum in here if you needed to. This should look somewhat familiar. I don't know if they're specifically using Bootstrap, but you can see this is very influential. If you look at what they have here, they have an image, a title, like a smaller title, like a main title, some text, read more. It's kind of where we're heading here. But notice that they have it as a grid system. Because, oops, let's go ahead and set it responsive.
How'd you move that image that was on the W3 school site into the folder?
Oh, so what I did is right-clicked,
Right-click, okay.
save image as,
Oh, save image as.
yeah, and then save it to that same folder where all
Alright,
your
save to
HTML is.
folder, okay.
Yeah, and then you might actually have to refresh the browser as well.
Okay.
And so this is interesting because you see it's kind of doing like a breakpoint type thing here. Something's definitely going on. There's some sort of breakpoint stuff going on here. It's maybe not as hard. They might be doing like a fluid container. And then all of a sudden, it went to a single column design. So let's take our card that we just created, and let's try to do something like that with our card. Okay, is everyone caught up so far? We're doing pretty good on time, so if we need to take a couple minutes just to breathe, we can do that. Is everyone good? Thumbs up if you're good. Okay. So let's do this. Let's start another example. Let's again copy and paste from the first example. Save this as ex4.html. So if you remember, if we wanted to set up a grid system, what did we have to do inside of container? What class? Does anybody remember the class name that we had to put? So we're going to do a grid. We've got our container. What do we put inside of container? So we do row. So class is equal to row. And then we'll cheat. We'll go back to example 3. Like I said, there's lots of copy and pasting. Make sure that you're just copying the appropriate stuff. So we want to just copy this div right here. So we don't want to also copy the container. We just want this one div, this card div. And paste that in here. Since we're going to be using a grid system, before to constrain this so it wasn't the full width of the page, they actually had to set a width of the image of 400 pixels. We can actually go ahead and get rid of that because we're going to, by putting it in a grid, it becomes automatically responsive. It'll make sense in a little bit why we're doing this. But the example doesn't really work that well if we keep that fixed width. So it's just like extra stuff we don't need. So I pasted in, so we have our container, we have our row, and then we have our card. And all I did was to our card was get rid of it. It's no longer fixed width. The grid's going to handle all that stuff for us. So we're saying it's a card, but we also want to specify our columns in here. So let's do this. Let's say on medium and larger, we want it to be like a 3-column design. So we're going to say it's going to span 4, 4, and 4. Okay. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, okay, it's going to, on medium and larger, we want it to span 4 slots, columns. It's tough because I keep on using the term columns, and I guess it's kind of your perspective. It's like, if I'm looking at a page and I see 2 things side by side, I say, oh, that's a 2-column design, but it's actually a 6 and a 6. Does that make sense? So here we're saying that it's going to span 4 columns because I want 4, 4, and 4. And then let's just do some copy and pastes here. So let's copy and paste this card. So the idea is that within a row, we just basically have this same card 3 times. So we're kind of getting to the point where there's too much HTML to fit on the screen. So the outer thing here is the container. Then we've got a row that contains everything. And then we've got our 3 cards. And all I've done is within class, I said it's going to be a card, but it's also, remember, we can apply multiple classes within this class declaration. We can say class equals, well, it's going to be a card, space, and it's also going to be column, medium, 4. So what that means is 4 and larger. So for medium, large, and extra large, it's going to span 4 of those columns, 4 of the 12. Okay, and so when we actually do our responsive design here, or pull our responsive bars here, notice those breakpoints. Also notice we didn't the images by default are responsive. We didn't have to do anything particularly special to make this work correctly. We didn't have to add up a bunch of pixel values. We didn't have to work with percentages. We didn't have to do any of that. We just said, okay, on our 12-column system, this is how many of those columns it's going to take up. And so we got automatic responsive images, even on small devices, but then on medium. But as soon as we hit small, it collapses down to a single column design. You can see this. If you were to add images of birds and some additional text and links and stuff, this is pretty darn close to what the Audubon Society is doing. So you do have to tailor your images a little bit, because if I were to try to do something like right here where this is taking up 2/3, let's see if I can find a better image that takes up 2/3. I guess we'll just have to work with that. Like this image right here, it might not scale that well to taking up 2/3, depending on how we set it up. So sometimes you do have to be a little bit mindful of your images. You can't just plop a bunch of random images. You should be able to kind of tell from here that what they've done is they probably have a standard image size, and before they upload, they probably crop everything. There is another technique called object fit, that what you do is that you put the main action item, or whatever the main thing is. In this case, it's what is this? I'm not very good at telling my birds. Is that like a hawk or something? I don't know. Whatever this is, there'll be.
That is a hawk. Yeah.
Okay. They'll put just kind of some extra tree branches around this, and then what'll happen is it kind of auto zooms. That's another technique. I don't really want to talk about it. I don't want to get overly complicated, but if you're interested, it's called object fit. And what that does is it makes it so that you don't have to rescale the image. All it does is that as it gets smaller, it automatically crops to the center of the image. And so if you're kind of clever about how you take your photographs, you can make it so that the main thing is still in the image, It's just, you just don't have some extra stuff around it. But anyway, but just kind of as a thought experiment, if I wanted to have a 2/3, 1/3 card, what would I change this value to from 4 to what?
Just wanted it to be 2.
So yeah, so I want this. So well, let me think how to say this. I want it to mimic this right here. So this takes up 2/3 of the screen. This takes up 1/3 of the screen. What column value would I use for this?
8.
8, and then what for this?
4.
Perfect. So there are some pros and cons to using Bootstrap. One of the problems is that Bootstrap sites tend to look almost all the exact same. You can customize like colors and stuff like that. You can do a little bit of customizations, but they tend to follow this a lot, like this grid-based design where they've got like this card-looking thing that operates a certain way. But that's not the worst thing in the world either. You know, you might not have the most creative site, but if you're like creating a site for, you know, Big Apple Pizza, do you think they really care about like being on the bleeding edge of design and artwork and stuff like that? They probably just most likely want a simple site that everyone can use to order their pizzas, you know? It's kind of the same thing here. So you do have to know your audience a little bit. In this case, I'm imagining probably Audubon Society. Again, they'd probably just want to present their content in the clearest way possible. Bootstrap is really good for that. So it makes your site look a little bit generic, but it's really, really good at presenting the material in a clear, consistent way. Notice that we don't have any inconsistent margins, inconsistent padding, inconsistent font sizes, or line heights, or anything like that throughout the site. Things tend to be very, very consistent. So we've got some time. I do want to go over one thing briefly. There are a bunch of these different components. This one's called Jumbotron. I don't see this on sites, like commercial sites, very often, but I do see it on like, I think how to put this. Like if I were to create a software library, and I don't, like a lot of software engineers, myself included, we don't spend a lot of time in Photoshop creating images or anything like that. So this Jumbotron is a very effective way of kind of having large text to say a thing to fill up space without actually having to add images. Notice that in this Bootstrap site, you don't actually tend to see images very often. So this is just one of the many components available. There's a huge amount of these. Next week we're actually gonna, the reason I didn't want to give you your assignment just yet, next week we're gonna talk about navigation bars. If you remember on your previous assignment, I gave you the show hide thing, the show hide JavaScript as extra credit. We get that by default with the Bootstrap navbar. We don't actually have to write any JavaScript. It just, once it reaches a certain point, it goes to that little hamburger icon thing. Let me just show you really quick. We're not gonna code it, but just so you can see it. So here's our navigation at the top. And again, you can change colors and all that sort of stuff. And then once it reaches a certain point, it collapses down to, I think they call this the hamburger. And then you just get this for free without having to write any JavaScript. So it's pretty convenient. But let's briefly talk about the color system. So one of the issues that a lot of sites have is that people use colors there's got to be a better example. I guess we'll start off with this. So what'll happen is people will use colors like hex values and stuff like that, and there's a lot of copying, pasting, a lot of where like the color is a little bit off. And what they did is they made color classes. So for example, we've got muted, primary, success, info, warning. And you can see we're not saying that it's that color, but there is a color associated with it. Like primary in this theme is blue, success is green, warning is going to be red. No, warning is yellow, red is danger, I think. Muted is like a slightly muted color, I guess. I don't know what it's more like a grayish color. What's nice is that there are theme generators that if you decide you want different colors, you can go in there and then change that, and these classes automatically change. And then it makes it so that your colors are extremely consistent across the entire site. Somebody built a tool. How many people have heard of the source code management site GitHub?
Yeah.
And so so that's just kind of like a source code management system. What people did as an experiment was open source software. What they did is they actually had to crawl and go through and look at all the various colors, and they found huge inconsistencies with some actually pretty large sites. And this is nice. By using this, it forces you to use a minimum number of colors, and then you can form more of a theme than having a bunch of random colors. Okay, so one of the great things about Bootstrap is consistency. But let's do this. We already saw a button. Let's go over here to button. Let's talk about this briefly. We have a little bit of time left, if my talk is right. Okay. So a lot of times what you do is with these components, you take something like, say, for example, there's a class called button, and it gives you a button. So let me do this. Let me just show you what a normal button looks like. Oops. So we want to keep that. This is what a button normally looks like. And if you ever coded HTML, class equals btn, and it's nice because it kind of forms a base layer. Then what you do is that you take these. Remember we talked about these. It's by function. It's basically by what it does or what it means. So you're not specifying the color necessarily, but you do get a color back. And so you can say, okay, the primary color for my site is going to be like this blue color. But we don't refer to it as blue. We just say, okay, this is going to be of type primary. A good example would be like if you had a form on your website and you had like submit and cancel. Some of this gets into user interface theory, is that you want to draw the attention to the most common task. 90% of the time, this is a made-up number, but the bulk of the time, after somebody fills out a form, what are they going to press? Cancel or submit? Submit. So what you do is that's the idea of primary, is that it calls their vision and their attention toward this button. That way they don't accidentally cancel their form and get irritated that they accidentally canceled it. But you still want that cancel button available if they search a little bit. So they might have to scan a little bit around the page visually, but they'll be able to find it. Okay. So let's modify our card button a little bit. So back to example 4. So you can see here it was button primary. But let's say, for example, we did on our second one, we wanted danger for some reason. Actually, hold on. Do they still call it danger? Yeah. And then the last one we'll just change to info. Now, what do you notice on line number 26? So look at this. This is ahref equals something. But here, it's button. What's cool about this is that you can take things, other HTML elements, and style them however you want. So here, you usually use buttons in the context of like an actual form, but sometimes you want your button to act as a link. In this case, that's with this card, that's what they did. And so what's cool about these classes is that even though I've got the anchor tag, this is a link. I said, okay, but I want this to look like a button. So we're able to actually take our link and style it like a button. This is really, really cool for consistency because it's very common on web pages where sometimes you use a button, sometimes you're using an anchor, depending on whether you're getting data or posting data and so on. And it can cause inconsistencies in the UI. But here it's saying that doesn't really matter because most people see a button and it's a thing to press and something happens. So you don't really care if it's a button or an anchor tag. we're going to let you make both look the same because as far as the user is concerned, it performs some sort of action. So you can see this here. Okay. So I think that's a good stopping point. I've kind of given you like a very broad overview of everything. Next week, what we're going to do is we're going to cover the Navbar. Unfortunately, the Navbar, like many things, it's extremely, extremely verbose. But there's a lot of copying and pasting. Let's see if we can see a full example with Navbar. It's not too bad. I think it gets a little bit more complicated when you want to do like drop-down menus and when you want it to make it responsive and stuff like that. But again, a lot of it's copy, paste, modify. And so what we'll do next week is we'll learn about the Navbar, and then we'll use that info to actually try to create some sort of full web page. So we'll have the Navbar, probably something with cards, maybe some sort of title, maybe even a footer, and then we'll make that responsive, and then that'll essentially be our assignment. Is to do something like that, is to take those basic concept of having a navigation on your site, some cards, a footer, and then put your own content in. Don't just use generic stuff. Try to make some sort of realistic site like a restaurant, or maybe even if you want to get started on your own site, promoting your own art or photography or whatever. Okay. So we have a little bit of time, but I think we can break early. I don't want to start anything new. Any questions on either the content for today or just anything in class in general? Okay, so keep an eye on that. We have 3 assignments left and then the final exam. Keep an eye on your grades. I think most people in here are doing okay. I've been a little lenient because I realize this is not, most people in here aren't going to school to make websites. Most of you have other interests, but this is one of those skills that if I can kind of keep your attention long enough that maybe once you get out of school and you want some extra money on the side, and you're like, well, I learned all that stuff in CGS4828. Maybe I can make some extra money here, so that you've got those basic skills. I'm trying not to be overly code heavy. I realize I probably am, but I'm definitely doing my best not to. Okay. Okay, so that's good. If there's no questions or comments or concerns, no new assignment next week. But I would, just kind of go through this stuff again next week. That way, go over the examples we did, just review. That way next week when we get to class, we don't have to do too much review, okay? All right, enjoy your week, and I'll see everybody next week.